Can you run?
The night Isolde Macapagal climbed through the broken shutter above her bedroom ceiling. Her hands were still bleeding. She did not look back. She could not. Because downstairs, the sound of her father's boots, heavy, deliberate, unhurried, told her everything she needed to know. Lord Arsenio Macapagal was not searching the corridors in a panic. He was waiting. He always waited. He had learned long ago that she had nowhere to go, but tonight was different, because crouched on the rooftop beside the crumbling east chimney, one gloved hand already extended toward her in the dark, was a man she had never formally met, a man whose face she had only seen once across a crowded London ballroom. Half a year before her father had locked her inside this house and told the world she was as ill. The Duke of Ravenscroft, Edric Callanth, he said nothing. He only looked at her bruised wrist, then at her face, and something shifted behind his eyes, something cold and furious and dangerously quiet. "Can you run?" he asked. And Isolde, who had not been asked a single question in 3 years, not a kind one, not a gentle one, felt her throat close entirely. Could she run? She had forgotten what it meant to be asked anything at all. But why was the Duke of Ravenscroft on her rooftop in the middle of the night? What did he know? And what had her father done to bring a man like that silently climbing the walls of her prison? The answers are only just beginning. If you are new here, subscribe right now, because this story is going to break your heart before it heals it, and you do not want to miss a single part. Hit that subscribe button and let us begin. Isolde Macapagal had learned early in life that silence was the safest language a woman could speak inside Ashvale Manor. Not the comfortable silence of a house at rest, not the easy quiet of a winter evening, with a fire burning low and a book open on one's lap. This was the silence of held breath, of footsteps measured before they were taken, of doors eased shut rather than closed, because a door closed too firmly could wake something in Lord Arsenio Macapagal that was better left sleeping. She had mastered that silence by the time she was 9 years old. By 17, she had mastered everything else he required of her. Stillness at the dinner table, downcast eyes when guests arrived, a pleasant, unbothered expression that said nothing, offered nothing, cost nothing. She had become very good at being nothing. It was the only version of herself her father had ever permitted to exist inside those walls. Ashvale Manor sat on the western edge of a quiet Shropshire valley, far enough from London that society forgot it existed, and far enough from the nearest village that the people inside it could scream and not be heard. And not Isolde had never screamed. She had considered it. Once or twice, in the earliest years, when she had still believed that someone might come. But no one had come. And she had stopped believing in the kind of rescue that arrived from the outside world, long before she stopped hoping for it altogether. She was 23 now, and the world outside Ashvale's locked gates was something she knew only from the 18 months she had spent in London before her mother died. Those 18 months felt someone else's life entirely, a borrowed dream she had worn briefly, and then returned, crumpled and faded, upon the morning of Lady Celestine Macapagal's funeral, when her father had taken her by the elbow in the churchyard and said, very quietly, that they were going home and that she would not be going out again for some time. Some time had become 3 years. Her mother had been the thread holding everything together, and Isolde had not fully understood that until the thread snapped. Celestine had been gentle but not weak, warm but precise, and she had possessed some qualities Isolde had never been able to name, some particular stillness in the presence of her husband's moods that kept the worst of him from fully surfacing. When she was alive, Lord Tarsenio was merely cold, merely controlled, merely the kind of man who corrected his daughter's posture at the table with a hand pressed to, firmly between her shoulder blades. When she was gone, the coldness became something else entirely. It had not happened all at once. That was the cruelty of it. It had come in degrees, each one small enough to be explained away, each one a fraction past the last, until Isolde looked up one afternoon and realized that she had not left the house in 14 months, that the housekeeper no longer met her eyes, that the 3 housemaids who had served Ashvale for years had all been replaced by women who did not speak to her, and that the locks on her bedroom door had been changed from the outside. She told herself it was grief, that her father was grieving, that this was what grief looked like in a man who had never learned how to carry it gracefully. She told herself that for a very long time. The bruises were harder to explain away. They had started as accidents, a grip held too long, a shove that he immediately walked away from, as though it had not happened, as though the wall she had stumbled into had appeared from nowhere. She had learned not to mention them. Mentioning them produced a particular expression on Lord Arsenio's face, a slow and terrible patience. That was somehow worse than the bruises themselves, so she said nothing. She wore sleeves that covered her wrists. She arranged her hair to fall forward over her cheekbone when it needed to. She became very good at that as well. What she had not become good at was pretending she was not frightened. She was frightened all the time now. It lived in her chest like a trapped thing, small and frantic, beating against her ribs every time she heard his footsteps in the corridor, every time the study door opened after midnight, every time he looked at her across the dining table with that particular expression, the one that meant he was measuring her, calculating her, deciding something she was not permitted to know. She had begun to understand, in the weeks before the night on the rooftop, that her father was not simply a cruel man, indulging his cruelties in private. There was something purposeful about it now, something arranged. The new solicitor who had come twice in the past month, and left without meeting, Isolde's eyes, the conversations that stopped when she entered a room, the way her father had begun asking her, in his most pleasant voice, whether she felt well, whether she was quite all right, with the particular concern of a man who wished for a specific answer and intended to receive it. She did not know what he was planning. She only knew that something had shifted, and that the shift was pointed directly at her. On the evening before the night she climbed through the roof, she had been sitting in the upstairs corridor outside the library. Not because she had any reason to be there, but because the library was one of the few rooms in the house that still felt faintly like her mother, and sometimes she needed that badly enough to risk the walk down the east wing. She had not been inside. She had only sat on the narrow bench beside the door, her hands folded in her lap, breathing in the faint trace of Celestine's old perfume that still clung to the woodwork after 3 years. That was when she heard it. Her father's voice, low and clipped, coming from behind the closed library door. Another voice answering him, a man she did not recognize, speaking in a tone that was somehow both formal and deeply uncomfortable, like a man who had agreed to something he was already beginning to regret. She caught only fragments, a name she did not know, a sum of money stated plainly without apology, and then her own name, spoken in her father's voice, in the tone he used when discussing property. Isolde sat very still on the bench. She did not move for a long time after the voices stopped, and it was only later that night, lying in her locked room in the dark with her hands pressed flat against the mattress to stop them trembling, that she began to look, really look, at the broken shutter above her wardrobe, that the housemaids had reported to her father twice, and that he had never sent anyone to fix. She had never thought about why he had left it. She thought about it now. What exactly had that man offered her father? And why, in all the months of silence and unlocked doors, had Lord Isolde Macapagal suddenly begun asking his daughter whether she felt well? She stared at the shutter for a long time, and then, very quietly, she began to plan. She had 3 hours before her father's household retired for the night. She knew his patterns the way she knew her own breathing. Lord Isolde Macapagal was a man of rigid routine, and his rigidity had become, without him ever intending it, the only map she had ever been given of her own survival. He took his evening meal at 7. He retired to his study at 8:30. By 11, the last of the house candles were extinguished on the ground floor, and by midnight, the corridor outside her room fell entirely silent. She had never used that silence for anything before. She had simply lain inside it, listening to it stretch, counting the hours until morning the way a prisoner counts the stones in a wall. But tonight she pulled it around herself like armour and began to move. The wardrobe was heavier than she had anticipated. She had not accounted for the fact that 3 years of confinement had taken something from her body that she had not noticed losing, some quiet reserve of physical strength that had simply diminished. Like a candle left burning in a closed room, her arms shook as she dragged it inch by careful inch across the floorboards, and she stopped twice, pressing her forehead to the wood and breathing slowly, listening for footsteps in the corridor below. None came. The broken shutter was exactly where she remembered it. A rectangular panel in the upper corner of the wall above the wardrobe, barely large enough for a woman's body, its iron latch long since rusted away, and the wood warped outward at one edge, just enough to admit cold air, and, she had calculated, a pair of shoulders if they were angled correctly. She had thought about it for hours the night before. She had thought about it in the specific, methodical way she had learned to think about everything inside Ashvale, not with hope, because hope was too fragile and too loud, but with the flat precision of someone who has stopped waiting to be saved and started calculating exit distances instead. She climbed the wardrobe carefully, testing each shelf with her weight before she trusted it, and when she finally pressed her palms against the broken shutter and felt it give outward under her hands, the cold night air hit her face so suddenly that her eyes filled without warning. She had not felt open air in 14 months. She pressed her lips together and climbed through. The roof was not what she had imagined. She had imagined something vast and terrifying, a great exposed plain of slate and sky with nothing to grip and nowhere to brace. In reality, the east wing roof was shallow-pitched and edged with a stone parapet barely as high as her knee, the surface still faintly warm from the day's pale sun, and immediately to her left, a wide chimney stack that she could lean against while she steadied herself. She was steadying herself against it, her back pressed to the warm stone, her breath coming too fast and too shallow, when she heard the sound. Not from inside the house, from above and to the right, a quiet, deliberate sound. The controlled movement of a person who did not wish to be heard but was not quite silent enough to disappear entirely. She turned. He was already watching her. Edric Calanthe, the Duke of Ravenscroft, was crouched at the far corner of the roofline, where the east parapet met the garden wall, one knee braced against the slate, and one gloved hand resting on the stone edge, perfectly still, in the manner of a man who had been waiting for some time and had made his peace with waiting longer. He was not what she expected from a duke on a rooftop in the dark. There was no evidence of panic, no breathless urgency, no expression that suggested this was anything other than an entirely ordinary place to spend a Wednesday evening. He simply looked at her, and the looking was steady and very careful, the kind of attention that took everything in at once without announcing itself. She did not speak. She could not. Immediately, her heart was hitting the inside of her chest with a force that made coherent thought difficult, and some part of her brain was still insisting, even now, that this was not real, that she had fallen asleep against the locked door again, and this was the particular kind of dream that came when desperation had nowhere left to go. But his eyes moved to her wrist, the left one which she had wrapped in a strip of torn linen before climbing, because the bruising there was deep enough to make gripping painful, and she had needed to grip the wardrobe shelves. He looked at her wrist for a long moment. Then he looked at her face. "Can you run?" he asked. The question undid something in her that she had not known was still holding together, not because it was tender. It was not tender. It was practical and direct and quietly urgent, the question of a man already planning the next 10 minutes. But it was asked of her, to her, as though her answer was the only thing that mattered right now, as though the question of whether Isolde Macapagal could run was the most important question currently existing in the world. She had not been asked anything in so long. "Yes," she said, and was surprised to find she meant it. He moved immediately, rising from his crouch with the efficient ease of someone comfortable in his body, crossing the roofline toward her in a few measured strides, and she noticed that he moved across the sloped slate with a sureness that was not accidental. This was not his first time on a rooftop in the dark. That realization should perhaps have alarmed her. It did not. He stopped a careful distance from her and extended his hand, palm upward, not grabbing, offering. "There is a section of the parapet 2 windows east of here where the stone has crumbled enough to give footholds," he said, keeping his voice very low. "The garden wall is low on the north side, and there is a horse waiting in the lane. We have perhaps 12 minutes before the watchman makes his second pass." Isolde stared at him. "You have been watching this house?" "Yes." "For how long?" Something moved briefly across his face. "Long enough," he said, "to know that you should have left it considerably sooner than tonight." There was no softness in the words, no pity that she could detect, which was fortunate, because pity would have destroyed her composure entirely, and they had 12 minutes. But there was something underneath them that she felt rather than heard, something compressed and carefully contained, and it took her a moment to identify it, because she had not encountered it, directed toward herself in a very long time. It was anger, clean and cold and aimed, very precisely, not at her. She took his hand. The footholds were exactly where he had said they would be. She did not let herself think about the drop below, or the sound her father's voice would make if he found her room empty. She focused on the stone under her fingers, and the steadying pressure of the Duke's hand when the crumbled parapet shifted under her foot. And then she was down, and he was beside her, and they were moving through the dark garden at a pace that was not quite running, and was not quite walking, and that covered distance with a speed she had not expected from either of them. She did not look back at Ashvale. She wanted to. Some part of her, the part that had spent 3 years inside those walls, building elaborate, careful structures of endurance, felt the pull of it sharply. As though the house itself had a gravity she was only now beginning to escape, and might at any moment be dragged back into. She did not look back. The lane was exactly where he had said it would be, and the horse was a dark, heavy-shouldered animal that stood quiet and patient while the Duke lifted her onto the saddle with a practised ease that bypassed any discussion of propriety entirely, because there was no room for propriety here, and they both understood that without needing to say so. He swung up behind her, and they were moving before she had fully registered that she was actually, genuinely, irrevocably leaving. The cold air pressed against her face. The lane opened into a wider road, and the wider road curved north, and the lights of Ashvale Manor fell behind the tree line and disappeared. Isolde breathed. She breathed in a way she had not breathed in 3 years. Not the careful, shallow breathing of a woman managing herself inside a dangerous house, but deeply, fully, with a chest that suddenly had room to expand. And then, because the shock of it was beginning to settle into her bones and her hands were shaking, against the horse's neck, and the Duke was a large, warm, entirely silent presence behind her, whose reasons for this she still did not know. She asked the only question that mattered. "Why?" she said. "Why were you watching that house? Why were you on that roof? You do not know me. We have never spoken. You are the Duke of Ravenscroft, and I am nobody, and I need to know why you came." He did not answer immediately. The horse moved beneath them, steady and unhurried now, and the road stretched dark and empty ahead, and the silence went on long enough that she began to think he would not answer at all. Then he said quietly, "I knew your mother." Isolde went very still. "She asked something of me," he continued, "before she died. I was too late to fulfill it while she was living. I intend to fulfill it now." The trees moved overhead, the cold pressed in from all sides, and Isolde, who had spent 3 years constructing careful walls around every feeling she possessed, because feeling things inside, Ashvale had only ever made her a more readable target, felt the first crack appear in every single one of them at once. Her mother had known this man. Her mother had asked him for something, and whatever it was, it had brought the Duke of Ravenscroft silently across her father's rooftop in the dark of a Wednesday night to offer her his hand. They rode for 2 hours before he slowed the horse. Isolde had not spoken since his last words had landed between them and settled there like a stone, dropped into deep water. She had not been able to. The information had too many edges, and she was too raw to handle any of them carefully yet. So she had done what she had always done when something arrived that was too large to immediately contain. She had gone quiet, and she had held it, and she had waited until her mind found solid ground beneath the feeling. Her mother had known the Duke of Ravenscroft. She turned that over slowly, the way you turn something fragile in your hands, looking for the shape of it. Celestine Macapagal had been a woman of considerable social grace and considerable private sorrow, and she had kept the two things carefully separated for as long as Isolde could remember. She had friends in London that her father had tolerated because they were useful, and connections that he had encouraged because they served him, and a very small interior life that she had guarded so precisely that even Isolde, who had loved her with the specific fierceness of a child who understands early that one parent is all that stands between herself and something dangerous, had only ever been permitted glimpses of it. What had her mother hidden, and why had she hidden it from her? The house Edric Calanth brought her to was not what she expected. She had constructed, during the ride, a vague image of somewhere large and formal, a ducal estate with a staff who would look at her with careful blank faces and show her to a room that was comfortable, but essentially another form of confinement. What he brought her to instead was a low stone farmhouse set back from a narrow road behind a windbreak of old oaks, with a single candle burning in the ground floor window, and a woman in her 50s standing in the open doorway with the expression of someone who had been awake for some time and was unsurprised by their arrival. "Mrs. Pell," the Duke said, swinging down from the horse. "She needs warm water, food if she will take it, and sleep if she can manage it." Mrs. Pell looked at Isolde for a long moment with the kind of look that took in a great, deal and pass judgment on none of it. Then she said, "Come inside then," and stepped back from the doorway, and the warmth from the interior reached out into the cold night like something almost unbearably kind. Isolde climbed down from the horse herself, refusing to examine why she did not wait for him to help her. Some instinct in her was still sorting, still measuring. She had spent 3 years in a house where every offered hand had hidden cost, and she did not yet know the cost of his. The inside of the farmhouse was low-ceilinged and plain, and smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs and the particular clean smell of a house where someone actually lived. Mrs. Pell set water to heat without ceremony, and placed bread and cold meat onto the table without commentary, and said nothing further, which was exactly right. And Isolde found herself sitting in a wooden chair by the fire, with a cup of something warm between her palms, before she had quite registered how she got there. The Duke sat across the room, not close. He had chosen the chair nearest the door, which she noticed, and she thought he had perhaps chosen it deliberately, so that she could see clearly that the space between them was her own. She looked at him properly for the first time since the rooftop. He was younger than she had expected from his reputation, though not young exactly. Somewhere in the early 30s, with the kind of face that was not immediately readable, composed and angular, and giving nothing away without intention. His coat was dark and travel-worn, and there was a cut on his right hand, she noticed, that he had not mentioned, the kind of cut that comes from moving through something that resists being moved through. He held himself with the particular stillness of a man accustomed to waiting, but there was something underneath the stillness that was not restful, something that had been in motion for a long time and had not fully stopped. She said, "Tell me about my mother." He looked at her. "You should sleep first." "I will not sleep until you tell me." A pause. He appeared to consider arguing, and then decided against it, which she appreciated. She had very little patience left for being managed, even gently. "I met Lady Celestine 4 years ago," he said, "through a mutual acquaintance in London. Not socially. She sought me out, specifically." He paused again, choosing his words with a care that told her the story he was about to give her had been shaped and trimmed, and was not the whole of it. Not yet. She had become aware of certain activities your father had been conducting through his business interests, financial arrangements that were not legal and not simple, involving men of some consequence and a great deal of other people's money. Isolde's hands tightened around the cup. What kind of arrangements? The kind that require a continuous supply of new capital to conceal the absence of the original, he said. Your father has spent the better part of a decade constructing an edifice of fraudulent investment that has taken money from families who could not afford to lose it, and funneled it through a series of instruments that exist only on paper. The men involved are protected by their own complicity. The scheme has survived this long because the one person who understood its full architecture was your mother, and she was persuaded, through means I will not detail tonight, to remain silent about it. The fire crackled. Isolde set the cup down on the arm of the chair because her hands were no longer steady enough to hold it without it showing. She came to me, he continued, because she had found documentation, evidence substantial enough to bring the entire arrangement down. Not just your father, but the men above him, the men who had built the scheme around him and were using him the way you use a wall to hide a window. She wanted it out of the house. She wanted it somewhere safe before she decided what to do with it. And then she died, Isolde said. And then she died, he agreed. And the way he said it was flat and very controlled, and told her, in the space of 4 words, that he did not believe it had been an accident, and that he had been living with that belief for 3 years, without being able to prove it. The room seemed very small suddenly. The firelight pressed in from all sides, and the warmth that had felt like kindness a few minutes ago now felt like something she needed to breathe through carefully. Her father had done more than lock her inside a house and hurt her when it suited him. She had known somewhere beneath the surface of everything that the machinery was larger than she could see. She had felt the edges of it in those overheard conversations, in the solicitor's visits, in the particular ways Lord Arsenio looked at her across the dinner table in those last months, as though she were an asset being prepared for transfer. She had not known it was this large. "The documentation," she said. "Did you get it out?" Something shifted in his expression. "No. Why not?" "Because your mother died before she told me where it was." The silence that followed, that was long and heavy, and full of things neither of them said immediately. Isolde looked at the fire. She looked at it for quite a long time, letting the pieces arrange themselves, letting the shape of the thing emerge from the information he had given her. And when it emerged, she felt it land in her chest with the particular weight of something that was both terrible and clarifying. Her father had not just been keeping her imprisoned, he had been keeping her available. She was, in whatever calculation Lord Arsenio Macapagal had been performing, connected to the documentation somehow. Either he believed she knew where it was, or he believed she could be used to ensure it never surfaced, or both. And the man she had heard speaking to him through the library door, the man whose offer had included her name, spoken in a tone reserved for property, was part of that calculation. She was not just a daughter who had become inconvenient. She was a piece of evidence he was managing. "He is going to sell me," she said. It came out very flat. She had thought it in the dark of her bedroom the night before, and she had understood it then as an abstract terror, but hearing herself say it aloud in a low salinged farmhouse, with a duke sitting across the room, made it concrete in a way that stripped the abstraction entirely away. Not in the conventional sense, not a marriage, or not only a marriage. He needs me somewhere controlled and silent, attached to someone who serves his interests, so that if the documentation ever surfaces, there is already a version of events in which I am not a credible witness. Edric Calanth looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not name. "Yes," he said quietly, "that is what I believe he intends. And you came because my mother asked you to protect me. I came because your mother asked me to protect you. And because I failed to do so for 3 years while I was building a case that kept collapsing every time I came close enough to use it. And because 2 weeks ago I received information that your father had accelerated his timeline considerably, and I was out of time to be careful." There it was, the crack in his composure, small and quickly closed. But there, he had not arrived on her rooftop out of noble efficiency. He had arrived because he was running out of time, and he knew it. And underneath the controlled steadiness, there was something that had been living, with urgency, for long enough to leave marks. She should have found that alarming. She found instead that it made him considerably more real than he had been before. "What information accelerated his timeline?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "The man who was in your father's library last week is named Aldous Fenwick. He is not merely a business associate. He is the man who built the original scheme, the one your father serves. And he does not make personal appearances unless he believes something is about to go wrong." He paused. "He has never met you. He wanted to." The fire popped and settled. Outside the window, the wind moved through the oaks with a sound like distant water. "So Fenwick is the one above my father," Isolde said. "My father is frightened of him. Your father is terrified of him," the Duke said, with a precision that distinguished the two things meaningfully. "Which makes him considerably more dangerous than he would be otherwise. Frightened men are predictable. Terrified men become unpredictable in ways that are very difficult to plan around. Isolde nodded slowly. She was aware that she was doing something she had not done in 3 years, not simply surviving a situation, but actively thinking inside one, turning information over, looking for seams, finding the places where the structure was weak. She had not realized until this moment how much of herself had gone dormant inside Ashvale, how many rooms of her own mind she had closed off because thinking too clearly in that house had always felt like a luxury she could not afford. She could afford it now. "The documentation my mother found," she said. "Where do you believe she hid it?" He met her eyes. And for the first time since the rooftop, she saw something move in his expression that was neither calculation nor controlled anger. Something that was simply and plainly relieved that she was asking the question. "I believe," he said carefully, "that she hid it somewhere only you would think to look." The fire burned low, the house was quiet, and Isolde sat with that sentence and felt, beneath the fear and the exhaustion and the enormous, disorienting strangeness of being outside for the first time in over a year, the first thin thread of something she had buried so deep she had almost forgotten the texture of it. Purpose. She had something to find, and someone, impossibly, was asking her to find it. But if the documentation was hidden somewhere, only she would think to look, that meant she would eventually have to go back. Back to the county where her father's reach was longest. Back toward the world she had only just escaped. And Aldous Fenwick, whoever he was, would be watching every road that led there. She had escaped the house. She had not yet escaped what the house contained. She slept for 4 hours and woke before the house did. The room Mrs. Pellew had given her was small and plain, and had a window that faced east, and the early light came through it without apology, thin and grey and very clean. The kind of light that made everything look exactly as it was whilst softening any of the edges. Isolde lay still for a moment in the unfamiliar bed, and let the previous night settle into her body as fact rather than dream. The rooftop, the horse, the farmhouse, the Duke's voice level and precise, telling her that her mother had known the shape of her father's crimes and had died before she could do anything about them. She got up before she could lie there, long enough to become afraid again. The kitchen was empty when she came downstairs, the fire already rebuilt, and a pot of water already heating, and she stood by it for a moment, with her hands extended toward the warmth, and thought about what came next with the same flat practicality she had used the night before climbing the wardrobe. Feeling come later. There was work to do first. She knew where her mother had hidden the documentation. She had known it, she realized, from the moment Edric Callanth had said somewhere, "Only you would think to look." She had known it, and her mind had immediately sheared away from the knowledge, because knowing it meant confronting everything that came after it, and everything that came after it required a courage she was not certain. In the grey pre-dawn of a farmhouse kitchen she actually possessed, there was a cottage, a small, low property on the western edge of the Shropshire Valley, 1/2 a mile from Ashvale's gate, and technically part of the estate, though her father had not used it in years. Her mother had called it her thinking place. She had taken Isolde there as a child on summer afternoons, not frequently, but enough the memory of it was warm and specific. A low stone room with a crooked chimney and a window that looked out over the valley. A loose flagstone near the hearth that Celestine had shown her when she was 7 years old, and told her, with a seriousness that had impressed itself on Isolde's memory without her understanding why, that some things were only safe when they were buried. She had been 7. She had thought her mother was talking about the pressed flowers and the small, folded drawings they sometimes left there, private things that belonged to the two of them, and that her father would not have understood. She understood now what her mother had been teaching her. She heard him behind her before she heard his footsteps. A small sound from the doorway that was controlled enough to not startle her, but present enough to announce itself, and she turned to find the Duke standing at the threshold of the kitchen with his coat already on, and the cut on his hand freshly wrapped, and an expression that told her he had not slept much either. "You know where it is," he said. Not a question. "Yes. How long have you known?" "Since last night," she said. "I needed time to be willing to know it." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of being moved by something, which was very quiet and very brief, and expressed itself primarily in a slight change in the set of his jaw. Then he said, "We need to move today. Fenwick will have men on the roads by morning." "I know. Going back into the valley means going within a mile of Ashvale. I know that too." She watched him absorb her steadiness. She watched him decide not to argue with it, which she appreciated more than she could easily articulate. They left the farmhouse within the hour. Mrs. Pell pressed food into Isolde's hands without ceremony and held her gaze for exactly 1 second with an expression that communicated wordlessly that she was not the first woman to pass through this house in difficult circumstances, and that Isolde's particular dignity in this moment had been noticed and respected. Isolde held the older woman's gaze and nodded once, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough. The ride back toward the valley was different from the ride away from it. The direction was the same road in reverse, but the feeling of it was entirely its own thing, heavier and more deliberate, with the landscape pressing in from both sides and the sky above them, a low flat white that offered no warmth and no reassurance. Isolde sat in front of him again, and neither of them spoke much, and the silence was not the silence of two people with nothing to say, but the silence of two people who are saving their attention for what is coming. They left the horse with a farmer Edric, knew a 1/4 mile from the valley road, and covered the remaining distance on foot through the tree line, moving parallel to the road rather than on it, and Isolde noticed that the Duke moved through undergrowth with a quietness that was trained rather than natural, the quietness of someone who had learned it specifically rather than grown up with it. She wanted to ask him where he had learned it. She filed it away instead. The cottage appeared between the trees exactly as she remembered it, smaller perhaps. Time had a way of shrinking the places memory had kept large. The stone was darker with damp, and the chimney had lost a course of bricks from its upper edge, and the window glass was filmed with 2 seasons of neglect. But the basic structure was solid, and the door, when Edric tested it, was only held by a simple latch that yielded without drama. Inside, the smell hit her first. Cold, ash and stone, and something faintly floral that could not possibly still be her mother's perfume after 3 years. But that her body responded to as though it was a sharp involuntary contraction in her chest that she pressed down firmly, because this was not the moment for it. She crossed to the hearth. The flagstone her mother had shown her was the 3rd one from the left, slightly narrower than its neighbours, with a chip along the eastern edge that had always been there. She crouched in front of it and pressed her fingers into the gap along its border, and felt it shift, loose in its setting, exactly as it had always been, and she lifted it. The cavity beneath was shallow, packed with oilcloth folded tight, and the oilcloth was intact. She lifted it out and set it on the hearthstone, and her hands were not entirely steady, but they were steady enough, and she unfolded the cloth with the careful movements of someone who understands that the thing inside has already cost more than she can fully calculate. The documents were dry, protected. A considerable sheaf of papers covered in her mother's precise handwriting, interspersed with copied ledger pages and 2 folded formal instruments that she did not immediately recognize, but that Edric, crouching beside her now, went very still upon seeing. "She got the contracts," he said quietly. "I did not know she had the contracts. What do they mean?" "They mean that Aldous Fenwick's name is on paper in a form that cannot be argued away," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite triumph, because it was weighted with too much of everything else, but that was the closest thing to relief she had heard from him. "This is enough. This is more than enough." Isolde looked at the papers in her hands. Her mother's handwriting. 3 years in the dark beneath our stone. 3 years of her father's escalating desperation, of locked doors and bruised wrists, and the slow dismantling of a woman who had been imprisoned in a different way from her daughter, but imprisoned. Nonetheless, Celestine had done this, quietly, methodically, at enormous personal cost. She had built the instrument of her husband's destruction, and hidden it in the place she trusted most, and then she had died before she could use it. Isolde was going to use it. She was folding the oilcloth back around the documents when she heard the sound outside. Not wind, not an animal. The specific sound of boots on wet ground, moving with the deliberate quietness of men who had been instructed to move quietly but were not quite good. Enough at it to disappear entirely. More than one pair. She looked at Edric. He was already on his feet, already at the window, looking through the filmed glass with an expression that told her what she needed to know before he said anything. 3 men, he said, very low. Possibly 4, east side of the tree line. A pause. "Your father is not among them. Fenwick's men," she said. "Yes." She stood. She held the oilcloth bundle against her chest, and she looked at the door, and then at the window, and then at the Duke, and she felt the fear arrive in full. At last, the fear she had been managing and deferring and holding at arm's length since the rooftop, and she let herself feel it completely for exactly 3 seconds, because pretending it was not there would make her slower, and she needed to be fast. Then she said, "What do we do?" He turned from the window and looked at her, and she saw him make a calculation and then discard it and make another. Then he said, "There is a second way out. The back wall has a section that has partially collapsed on the north side. It is low enough to go over, but it will require leaving the tree line and crossing open ground for approximately 40 yards before we reach the road." 40 yards of open ground, she said. "Yes, and the men are on the east side, for now." She understood the "for now" immediately. They were moving, which meant the window was closing, and the calculation was already expiring, and the moment for hesitation was gone. But she hesitated anyway. 1 moment, just one, standing in her mother's hiding place, with her mother's evidence pressed against her chest, looking at a man she had known for less than 24 hours, who had climbed her father's roof in the dark because a dying woman had asked him to, and she understood with a clarity that arrived, without warning, that she had already made a decision she had not consciously examined. She had placed herself, her freedom, and now the only thing her mother had left behind, inside the judgment of this man. She did not know if she was right to trust him. She only knew that she did. "Go," she said. They went. The back wall was exactly where he had said it was, and the collapsed section was low enough, and the 40 yards of open ground were the longest 40 yards of her life. The cold air hitting her face, and the wet grass loud under her feet, and the bundle of documents held against her body with both arms, and behind them, from the east side of the tree line, a shout that meant they had been seen. She did not stop. She ran with everything she had, which was more than she had known she possessed. across the open ground toward the road, with the Duke's footsteps even, and steadies, beside her, and the shout behind them, fracturing into several voices, and the road rising up ahead like a promise. And she thought, with a fierce and breathless clarity, of her mother's handwriting, of the years it had spent in the dark, waiting for someone willing to carry it into the light. She was not going to drop it now. They reached the road and kept moving. There was no time to stop, no time to assess, no time to do anything except put distance between themselves and the voices fracturing behind them through the trees. Edric moved with a directional certainty that told her he had already planned for this contingency, already mapped the roads and the distances, and the places where two people moving fast could disappear into the landscape without leaving a line that could be followed, and she matched his pace without question, because questioning it would cost seconds she did not have. They turned off the main road within minutes, cutting down a lane so narrow the hedgerows brushed both shoulders, and then through a gate into a field, and then along the field's edge where the ground was harder and their footprints less legible, and Isolde ran all of it with the documents held against her chest, and her breath coming in controlled bursts, and her mind doing the thing it had learned to do inside Ashvale, narrowing to the immediate, processing only what was directly in front of her, and setting everything else aside for later. Later was a luxury. Later was something you earned by surviving the present moment. The sounds behind them thinned and then disappeared, swallowed by distance and the low persistent wind moving across the open fields. And after another 10 minutes, Edric slowed to a walk, and she slowed beside him, and they moved in silence for a while, both of them breathing harder than they would have chosen to acknowledge, until the lane curved south and deposited them onto a wider road she did not recognize. He stopped at the road's edge. She stopped beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Sky above had shifted while they ran, the flat white breaking apart into something more textured, with pale light pressing through in uneven columns across the valley below, and the world looked, in that particular light, both very large and very still, as though it had paused to observe something. "They will regroup," he said. His voice was level, but she could hear the exertion underneath it, controlled but present. "Fenwick will know we have the documents within the hour. He will not send men to retrieve us after that. He will move to contain the damage by other means." "Which means he goes to ground," she said. "Which means he goes to ground. Yes, and takes my ability to use these documents through official channels with him, because the men who would act on this evidence are the same men he has been cultivating relationships with for the better part of a decade." He paused. "There is one man, a government solicitor named Harwick, who has been building a parallel investigation independent of Fenwick's influence. He is the only channel that cannot be closed before we reach it. But he is in London. 2 days' ride at minimum, through territory her father knew better than she did, with Fenwick's network already mobilizing, and her own face known to every man Lord Arsenio Macapagal had placed in the valley over the past 3 years. She looked down at the oilcloth bundle in her arms, her mother's handwriting, her mother's 3 years of careful, silent, terrified work. "Then we go to London," she said. He looked at her with that expression again, the one she had begun to read as something close to respect, which was a thing she had not received from anyone in so long that she was still not entirely sure how to hold it without flinching. "There is something I need to tell you first," he said. She had been waiting for it. She had known since the farmhouse kitchen, since the moment he had paused fractionally before answering her question about her mother, that he was holding something back. Not dishonestly. She had been around dishonesty long enough to know the texture of it, and this was not that. This was the particular restraint of a person who has information that will hurt, and is trying to find the right moment to deliver it, which was considerate, and also, she had decided somewhere during the night something she was done accommodating. "Tell me now," she said. He looked out across the valley for a moment. Then he said, "Your mother did not die of the fever they recorded. She had known this too, or she had suspected it with enough conviction that knowing it now landed, not as a shock, but as the confirmation of something she had been carrying for 3 years without a name for it. My father," she said. "Not directly, not by his own hand." A pause. "Fenwick has a man, a particular kind of man, who is introduced into households when something needs to be managed quietly. He was employed in the guise of a physician during your mother's final illness. The fever was real. What was done to ensure she did not recover from it was not." The field stretched out below them in the pale light. A bird moved across the far edge of the tree line, small and unhurried, entirely indifferent to the information currently reorganizing everything. Isolde had believed about her mother's death. She had grieved Celestine as a woman taken too soon by an ordinary cruelty of the body. She had grieved her with the particular grief of losing someone to something that had no face and no intent, and could not be confronted or punished. That grief had been enormous and shapeless, and she had lived inside it for 3 years, alongside everything else her father had done to her, and she had never once allowed herself to wonder whether it had a face after all, because wondering that inside Ashvale, alone, with no recourse and no one to tell, would have been a particular kind of unbearable. She allowed herself to wonder it now. She felt the grief shift, not diminish. It did not become smaller, but it moved, the way something moves when it finally finds the correct shape of its container, from formless and overwhelming into something harder and more precise. Something that had an edge to it, something that could be directed. Her mother had been murdered, and the man responsible was the same man whose name was written in the documents she was holding against her chest. "Harwick," she said. Her voice came out very steady, which surprised her. "The government solicitor. Will he be able to act on this, even if Fenwick moves to close the channel? If we reach him before Fenwick does, yes. Harwick has been waiting for the contracts specifically. Everything else he has been able to compile falls short without them. With them, he can move faster than Fenwick can contain." "How much faster?" "Days rather than weeks," he said. "Fenwick's influence operates through relationships that require cultivation. It cannot be activated instantly. If Harwick has the documents in his hands by tomorrow evening, the process begins before those relationships can be called upon. Tomorrow evening." She looked at the road ahead and calculated what tomorrow evening required of her. How many miles, and how many hours, and how many roads that ran through her father's territory, and she felt the weight of it settle onto her shoulders with a completeness that was almost physical. She also felt, underneath the weight, something she had not felt since the night her mother died. She felt like herself. Not the version of herself she had been inside Ashvale, reduced and careful and perpetually managing the distance between who she was and what was safe to show. But the earlier version, the one from the 18 months in London, when she had been young enough to still believe that her own intelligence and her own will were things she was permitted to use freely. That version of herself had not disappeared. She had only buried her, the way her mother had buried the documents, in the place most likely to keep her safe until the moment she was needed. That moment was now. "There is a coaching inn at Bridgenorth," Edric said. "A woman named Sorrel Vance keeps it. She has assisted me before. We can reach it before nightfall if we move steadily. And from there we take the London road with fresh horses and a cover that will hold at the checkpoints." She nodded. Then she said, "You loved her, my mother." It was not a question, and she had not planned to say it, but it arrived with the certainty of something that had been true for a while, and had simply been waiting for the correct moment to be spoken. She watched his face do something complicated, and then resolve into stillness, and the stillness itself was the answer. "Not in the way you might mean," he said after a moment. "She was 20 years my senior, and she was the most formidably perceptive person I have ever encountered, and she trusted me with something she trusted no one else with, and I failed to protect her. What I felt for her was the kind of feeling that does not have a simple name." He paused. "I have been trying to repay a debt that cannot be repaid for 3 years. I am aware that what I am doing now does not settle it." Isolde looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her mother choosing this man, seeking him out specifically, bringing him inside the secret architecture of her resistance, trusting him with the most dangerous information she possessed. Celestine Macapagal had not been careless with trust. She had been, if anything, too careful, so careful that even her daughter had only been given the barest edge of the truth, enough to find the documents, but not enough to be a liability while her father was watching. She had chosen Edric Callanth carefully, and she had been right too. "She was right about you," Isolde said. He looked at her. Something moved in his eyes that he did not attempt to suppress and did not attempt to name, and she did not press it, because some things did not need to be named immediately to be real. They began walking. The inn at Bridgenorth appeared as the light was failing, warm-windowed and low-roofed, with the particular settled look of a place that had been the same for a long time, and intended to remain so. The woman called Sorrel Vance met them at the yard gate with the brisk competence of someone who had been expecting them and had opinions about the timing, sharp-eyed and practical, and entirely unimpressed by ducal titles, which Isolde found immediately and deeply reassuring. There was a room. There was food that was hot and plain and real. There were fresh horses confirmed for the morning, and in the quiet of the room Mrs. Vance showed her to, with the documents placed flat under the mattress, and the candle burning low on the window-sill. Isolde sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself, for the first time, to feel the full length of the day. The bruises on her wrist ached. The cut on her palm from the rooftop shutter had reopened at some point during the running, and dried again without her noticing. Her body's a complete accounting of everything the past 24 hours had required of it, and she let herself feel that too, all of it, without the managed distance she had used inside Ashvale to make pain bearable. She was out, she was free. She had her mother's evidence in her hands, and a road to London ahead of her, and a man in the room below who had climbed her father's roof in the dark because a woman he could not save had asked him to protect the daughter she left behind. She was not safe yet. She knew that clearly and without illusion. Fenwick was moving, and her father was somewhere behind her, calculating, and the road tomorrow would be long and watched and uncertain. But she was not inside Ashvale, and she was not alone. She pressed her hand flat against the mattress and felt the slight resistance of the documents beneath it. Her mother's careful handwriting. 3 years of courage conducted in absolute silence, and she thought, with a ferocity that surprised her with its heat, that Celestine Macapagal had deserved to see this herself. She had not been permitted to see it, so Isolde was going to see it for her. Tomorrow, London. Tomorrow, Harwick. Tomorrow, the beginning of the end of everything Aldous Fenwick and Lord Arsenio Macapagal had built on the suffering of people who could not afford to lose what was taken from them. She blew out the candle and lay down in the dark, and did not sleep immediately. But this time the darkness did not press in from all sides the way it had inside Ashvale. This time it was simply dark. the ordinary dark of a room at night, and outside the window the sewed south was waiting, and she was ready, almost ready. There was still the matter of what she felt about the man downstairs. But that, she decided, was a question for a moment when Aldous Fenwick was no longer between her and the ability to think clearly. Soon, though, soon. They left Bridgenorth before first light. Sorrel Vance had the horses ready in the yard without being asked. Two solid animals that stood patient in the cold dark while Edric checked the tack, and Isolde stood beside them with the oilcloth bundle secured. Beneath her travelling cloak, and the particular focused stillness of someone who has already said everything to themselves that needs saying and is, now simply ready to move, she had slept 4 hours. It was enough. It had to be. The London road was quiet in the early miles, the kind of quiet that belonged to the hour before the world remembered itself, with mist lying low across the fields and the trees on either side of the road, reduced to dark shapes that appeared and disappeared as they moved through them. They rode at a pace that covered ground without announcing urgency, the pace of people with ordinary business and ordinary destinations, and Isolde kept her hood forward and her eyes on the road ahead and thought about Harwick. Edric had told her more about him over the meal the previous evening. A careful man, methodical. The kind of government official who had survived in his position precisely because he was not spectacular enough to attract the attention of people like Fenwick. He had been building his case for 6 years. He had come close twice and been blocked both times by the removal of key witnesses, not violently, simply the particular administrative violence of powerful men, ensuring that certain people were relocated, discredited, or made to understand the cost of continued cooperation. He had kept going anyway. 6 years of quiet, unglamorous, dangerous persistence in the face of a system that had every incentive to remain exactly as corrupt as it was. Isolde found that she felt something close to kinship with him before she had ever met him. They were 2 hours south of Bridgenorth when the rider appeared behind them. She felt Edric register it a fraction before she saw it herself. A slight change in his posture, a controlled alertness that he kept from becoming visible in his hands or his pace, and she matched it immediately, keeping her own body easy and unhurried while her eyes found the figure in the road behind them, and assessed it with the speed of someone who had spent 3 years reading threat from small signals, one rider, moving at a pace that was not quite casual, maintaining distance without closing it. He has been behind us since the crossroads, Edric said very low. Fenwick's man? I don't know yet. She thought about that for a moment. Then she said, if Fenwick knew our route he would not send one man. A pause. No, he agreed. He would not. So either this is someone who followed us from Bridgenorth independently, or it is someone who was already on this road for other reasons. Or, he said, with a precision that told her he had already considered this, and was uncertain whether to say it. It is someone your father sent, rather than Fenwick. She absorbed that. Her father and Fenwick were not the same calculation. Her father was terrified of Fenwick, which meant he was capable of moving independently if he believed that independent movement served his survival. And Lord Arsenio Macapagal, whatever else he was, had always understood survival with a clarity that was the most purely animal thing about him. He would want the documents back, she said. But he would want me back more. I am more useful to him than the documents at this point, because I am the only one who can testify to where they were hidden, and how long they have existed, which means I am either his greatest liability or his greatest asset, depending on whether he can control me. She heard herself say it with the same flat precision she had used the previous night in the farmhouse, and she felt, as she had felt then, the strange cold clarity of understanding her own position inside someone else's calculation. 3 years inside Ashvale had taught her that. She had not chosen the lesson, but she had learned it completely, and now she was using it, and there was something in that, something she could not entirely name, that felt like the most complete form of refusal she had ever managed. Edric said, "We can lose him before the next town if we take the Eastern Fork." The Eastern Fork adds 2 hours to the London road. Yes. She looked at the road ahead. She looked it for a long moment, and she thought about Harwick waiting in London with 6 years of accumulated case building that fell short, without the contracts she was carrying. And she thought about what 2 hours meant, in the context of Fenwick's network and the rate at which it was currently mobilizing, and she made the only calculation that led to her mother's death meaning something. "Don't lose him," she said. "We let him follow us to London." Edric turned his head toward her. "If he follows us to Harwick's offices," she said, "and Harwick's offices are where we are going regardless, then the moment those documents are in Harwick's hands and the process is initiated, my father's man has nothing left to retrieve and no action left to take. We will be in a government building with a government solicitor and papers that have just been formally received as evidence. The only thing my father can do at that point is run. A silence. She could feel him working through it. "It is a considerable risk," he said. "Everything from the rooftop forward has been a considerable risk." Another silence, shorter this time. Then, very quietly, "Your mother would have said exactly that." She felt that land in the centre of her chest and let it stay there. They rode on. The mist burned off as the morning advanced, and the road widened, and the traffic on it thickened gradually. Farm carts and early coaches, and the ordinary industrious movement of a world that did not know what was being carried along its roads this morning, and Isolde moved through all of it, with the oilcloth bundle against her body, and her father's man a careful distance behind them, and London, accumulating on the horizon in the way cities did, first as a smell, then as a sound, then as a weight in the air that was both oppressive and, this morning, precisely what she needed it to be. Harwick's offices were in a narrow building, off a narrow street, looked from the outside exactly like every other narrow building on the narrow street, which she suspected was intentional. A clerk met them inside with the alert wariness of someone who had been briefed to expect either these exact people or something considerably worse. And within minutes they were in an inner room that was entirely lined with paper, organized with a precision that spoke of a mind that had been building towards something for a very long time and knew exactly where every piece of it lived. Harwick himself was smaller than she had imagined, not a quality she had expected to matter, and it did not matter, except that it struck her as she stood in his office, holding her mother's evidence, that the people responsible for the most patient and consequential forms of courage were almost never built the way stories suggested. He was a slight man in his late 50s with watchful eyes and ink-stained fingers and the kind of face that had learned long ago to reveal nothing in a professional context. When she placed the oilcloth on his desk and unfolded it, he looked at the contents for a long moment without touching them. Then he looked up at her. "These are the contracts," he said. "Yes. How long have they been in your possession?" "Since yesterday morning. They were hidden by my mother approximately 4 years ago." He nodded slowly. The nod of a man receiving information he had spent 6 years working toward, and was now processing with the methodical care it deserved rather than the relief he was visibly suppressing. He reached for the first document with the careful hands of someone who understood exactly what they were holding. "Lady Macapagal," he said, without looking up from the page, "your mother came to see me once, 4 years ago. She sat in that chair." He indicated the chair to Isolde's left without raising his eyes. She told me she would have documentation within the month. I did not hear from her again. The room was very quiet. She was prevented from reaching you, Isolde said. I know. A pause. I am sorry for what that cost your family. She nodded. She did not trust herself to say more than that in this particular moment, in this particular room, with her mother's chair, a foot to her left, and 3 years of everything it had cost, compressed into the space between them. The process that followed was not dramatic. That was the thing about the actual mechanics of justice that no one prepared you for adequately. The moment of delivery was administrative rather than triumphant, full of careful documentation and formal receipts and measured language, because the men who built these systems had understood that emotion was the enemy of precision, and that precision was the only thing that would hold in a court. Harwick worked with a quiet efficiency that was deeply reassuring in its absence of ceremony, and 2 of his clerks were called in, and the documents were formally received and recorded, and the receipts were signed and countersigned. And when it was done, the originals were locked in a case that Harwick sealed himself with a thoroughness that told her it would not be leaving his immediate custody. It was over in 40 minutes. The thing her mother had spent years building and died trying to deliver was in the hands of the one man positioned to use it, and the process that would end Aldous Fenwick and Lord Arsenio Macapagal was now initiated in a form that could not be uninitiated. She stood in the street outside the building afterward, and the London noise pressed in from all sides, and she felt the enormity of it settle over her the way weather settles, not all at once but in stages, each one heavier than the last. Edric stood beside her. He did not say anything immediately, and she was grateful for that. Then she said, "My father's man." "Gone," he said. "He left when we entered the building. He will have gone to Rippleport, and my father will run. He will try." A pause. Harwick's first action after we left that room was to send Turd to have the ports watched. "Your father is known at Dover. He will not find it as simple as he expects." She thought about Lord Arsenio Macapagal, discovering that the ports were closed to him, that the elaborate structure he had spent a decade building was collapsing from the inside outward, that the daughter he had locked in a room and called a liability had walked out of that room, carrying the instrument of his destruction. She thought about his face when he understood that Celestine, quiet and compliant and obedient Celestine, had built this against him from inside his own house, had hidden it in the one place he had never thought to search, because it had belonged to their daughter, and she felt something move through her that was not satisfaction exactly, but was the closest thing to it she had felt in 3 years. Her mother had won. She had simply needed Isolde to carry the victory to its conclusion. She had not let her down. She became aware that Edric was watching her, and she turned to look at him in the grey London morning, with the street noise around them, and the specific strange weightlessness of a person who has completed the thing they came to do, and has not yet decided what comes next. He looked back at her. He looked at her the way he had looked at her on the rooftop in the dark, with everything in and nothing announced. But it was different now. On the rooftop he had been looking at a bruised woman climbing through a broken shutter in the night. Now he was looking at something else entirely, something she was still in the process of becoming, and the looking was not the careful professional attention of a man fulfilling an obligation. She knew what it was. She had known it was coming for some time, and had been setting it aside until she had room for it, which she now had. She was not going to address it in a street in London, 40 minutes after delivering evidence of her father crimes to a government solicitor. She was not built that way, and she did not think he was either. But she held his gaze. She held it, and she let it mean what it meant, and she did not look away from it. because she had spent 3 years not being permitted to want things, and she was done with that entirely. "What happens now?" she asked. He considered it. "Harwick will move within the week. Fenwick will be taken before he can fully close his network. Your father will be found." A pause. "And you will need somewhere to go that is not Ashvale." "I am aware. I have a property in Wiltshire," he said. "It is not large, Mrs. Hell oversees it. You would be entirely at liberty there." She looked at him for a long moment. "At liberty," she said. "Completely," he said. And then, after a pause so brief she might have imagined it, "For as long as you wish, whatever that means, whatever that means." She heard the weight he had placed in those 3 words, and she chose to leave it there, not ignored, not addressed, simply present between them, like a question, with a long answer that deserved more than a London street, and 40 minutes out from the most consequential morning of her life. "Ask me again," she said, "when Fenwick is in custody, and my father is no longer in a position to require my father's daughter to be anything in particular." He nodded. Something moved in his eyes. That is fair. It was fair. It was also, she thought, a beginning dressed as a deferral, which was perhaps the most honest form a beginning could take when it arrived in the wreckage of everything that had needed to be cleared away first. She was 23 years old. She had climbed out of a locked room through a broken shutter with bleeding hands and no certainty of anything, and she had walked her mother's courage all the way to the only conclusion it deserved. And she was standing in a London street in the grey morning with a man she did not yet know fully, and a future she had not yet mapped, and she was, for the first time in 3 years, entirely and completely free to decide what it looked like. Her mother had made sure of that, had made sure of it at the cost of everything. Isolde was not going to waste a single day of it. She looked at Edric Callanth one more time, and whatever he saw in her face made him straighten slightly. A small involuntary adjustment, as though something had shifted in the space between them that required a new bearing. "Good," she thought. Then she turned toward the road and began to walk. And that is where Isolde Macapagal's survival ends, and her life, her real life, finally begins. If you have watched this far, you already know that you are exactly the kind of person this channel was built for. Someone who believes that the women history tried to silence deserve to be heard. Someone who stays until the very last word. Thank you. From the bottom of this storyteller's heart, thank you for being here for every part of this journey. If this story moved you, if it kept you up past the hour you intended, if Isolde felt real to you, even for a moment, please subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that bell so you never miss the next story, because there are more women like Isolde waiting to have their stories told, and every single one of them deserves an audience as devoted as you. Subscribe, stay. The next story is already coming.